This is a video for the driveway mechanic, lower control arm replacement on many GM vehicles. I'm not going to assume you have air tools or a lift or any of that stuff. You want to keep the vehicle as close to the ground as possible because you need the ground and a bottle jack usually, or a small floor jack, a little 2-ton one also available, from Harbor Freight. These are Harbor Freight images so that you can manipulate the lower control arm to get the bolt holes to line up to get the bolts in. It's not a lot of hammer mechanic stuff. It's working smarter, not harder. And the easiest way to do it is methodical. So what you'll need is a jack stand, at least one, a bottle jack, scissors jack or small floor jack, preferably 2 bottle jacks, so that you can manipulate it, twist it, to get the bolt to slide in. It's only 8 bolts total, but it's a frustrating job if you don't go about it just right and have the right tools. Here's a popular GM lower control arm. It fit a lot of vehicles in the early years. It's usually able to be found on eBay relatively cheap, brand new. Of course, it's from China. But almost everything's from China today. That's a replacement part. And they just don't tell you. Here's some of the vehicles that it fits. Further down here, there's a simple list. So it fits quite a few vehicles. And it's a complete lower control arm with bushings and a ball joint with a grease fitting. You're welcome to feel like you have to buy a brand name from somewhere else. Chances are it's Chinese anyway. They just bought it from China. And it is what it is. This is the tool I would recommend you use to separate the ball joint. A lot of people say beat on it with a hammer. Well, it doesn't happen often, but they can crack. And it's frustrating. And this takes 5 minutes. Beating on it with a hammer takes who knows how long. One problem with this tool, however, is the little fork there isn't wide enough for a GM ball joint, lower ball joint. You would need to get an angle grinder and gently open that fork there by about 1/8 an inch on each side. So an angle grinder, I don't know, sometimes on Harbor Freight is about $10. A hacksaw will not work. So the nice thing is this tool, as you tighten it up, when it gets tight, if it doesn't seem like it's gonna get it loose and it's good and tight, just tap on the top of it with a hammer and it'll pop right out. No muss, no fuss, safe. When you put the tool on there, leave the nut on it so that when it does break loose, it doesn't fall completely out of the spindle. So here's one of Harbor Freight's low-cost angle grinder. I believe this one's like $19, and it's usually available. And I think there's one more that's available for like $15. If we can find it, there it is, $14.99. So you only need to take off about 1/8 of an inch on each side of the inside of the fork that goes around the ball joint. For a tool for $20 and an angle grinder for $15. That's cheap. And if you look at the lower control arm itself at less than 70, I don't know what to say, because the job is normally $300 to $500 at a mechanic. It depends on how much you value your own money. The hose clamps, like these, should be used 3 on each side of the spring. They're difficult to get in there. You can't get them in there unless you take the shock absorber out, which you have to take out anyway. And 2 will hold, 3 will really hold, but 6 are safe. As if they break, that spring is going to really open up with some force. 6 are pretty safe. It takes a lot to break all 6 at once. While the car still has weight on it, put these on there and snug them up with the screw head obviously pointing up, down as far as you can get it so that you can snug it up. And then you can begin the process of taking out the lower ball joint. They're about $4.50 a pack, 3 in a pack, from AutoZone. Your parts store may have a different price. Probably the easiest way to do it is to get a coil spring compressor from AutoZone. Assuming you're near an AutoZone, this is the tool. It goes up the center where the shock absorber is. A little bolt on the bottom goes across the bottom, and then it pulls the coil spring down tight. You leave it on there when you take off the lower control arm. It's $50 to rent. But you get your money back. Another way to do it is to use 6 4-inch radiator hose clamps.
Guys, next up we have to remove the coil springs. So we have a coil spring tool like so.
It looks like a medieval torture device.
It could be used for that as well. Alright, so before we use this tool, we're going to apply a little bit of grease here to the washers, and it's just some high temp grease, and we're going to get some on the threads too, just to make this easier on them, because we are going to use an impact, which is something you're not supposed to do, but I like to get my projects done and not spend forever turning bolts, so we're going to cheat. Alright, so we hook these guys on here, and this tool fits here. Alright, so from here we're just going to tighten this long bolt. It's going to pull down those hooks and pull the spring down and compress it. Alright, with the spin jack in place, we can remove the lower control arm bolts. Now we can use the gun once it's broken loose. Look at these threads. These are going to clean right up. Beautiful. Just a wee bit of persuasion. All right, look at this, guys. This nut is totally loose. I just want to remove the cotter pin. Okay, glad we're doing all this, that's for sure.
Glad there was a cotter pin there.
Yeah, I've always kind of wondered, I'm like, you still gotta tighten the nut down and like it'll...
Okay, here's the link to that video. You can go watch the whole thing if you like. He does a little overkill. You do not need to remove anything other than the lower control arm ball joint nut, the one that he shows loose. You don't have to take off the brakes and all that other stuff that he does. It's basically 8 bolts to replace the lower control arm. And you don't need to do anything more. Okay, Harbor Freight has a number of floor jacks. They're all pretty costly, except way at the bottom you'll find this little cheap, basically useless one. Doesn't have very much guts to lift the vehicle. It's 2 ton, but it will lift the lower control arm to help get the ball joint back in, or control to let it down. If you don't have one, it's an okay investment. Don't expect too much out of it. So here's basically the order in summary. Loosen the lug nuts on the ground, jack it up with the bottle jack, or if it's a car and it's light, maybe this thing will work, but I would use a bottle jack. Put a jack stand under the frame portion somewhere. Remove the tire. While there's still weight on the lower control arm, you should have jacked it up under the lower control arm. Then remove the shock. Remove the sway bar control bolt, and put in your spring compressor, or if you don't have one, put in the 6 radiator hose clamps and snug them up. Then you can loosen the ball joint nut, and it's going to be a little fight to get the cotter pin out. That's often a 30 millimeter or a 24 millimeter, and you'll need a breaker bar usually to get it loose, and put on the Harbor Freight tool to push that ball joint out. As said earlier, you're going to have to widen the fork on it by a little bit with an angle grinder. You can get one at Harbor Freight. They're fairly cheap. You know, I've seen them as cheap as $10. I guess they're usually around $25. And don't take out too much. It only takes about maybe an 1/8 inch on each side. And slip it in there, tighten it up. It'll pop that lower ball joint loose, and then you can lower the vehicle onto the jack stand, which should now be still at riding height, very close to the ground. Don't jack it up high. You need to bottle jack and the floor jack to be able to lift this lower control arm up and down easily. Lift it enough after you've popped that ball joint loose with the nut still on it, so it doesn't come all the way out. You don't need to take off the brake. You don't need to take off anything other than that one nut. And then take out the 2 bolts that are holding the lower control arm. They may be a little tight, they may be a little rusty, as shown in the clip from Legit Streetcars. You may need to hit it with a hammer. And then the lower control arm will come down and out. You can, if you have it on the floor jack, you can simply let it down. If you have it on a scissors jack, like the OEM scissors jack, you crank it down slowly. And hopefully, if you're using radiator hose clamps, they don't let go. If they do, you'll still be able to get it back up in there by simply putting in the 2 bolts and hinging it. It will open wide enough to the ground to put the spring in, and then lift it from the center from the actual spring cup cavity with the scissors jack or the floor jack to get the ball joint back up into the spindle. And then the rest is all just reverse order. It's really not very hard, it's just a little tedious, and you need to pay attention to what you're doing. Go watch the Legit Streetcars video all the way through. I believe that section is about 15 minutes into his video where he removes the lower control arm. Thanks. Hit like and subscribe if you can. It would be nice and would help me out.